The day the monarchy in medieval England lost control and triggered a dangerous power shift. Have you ever wondered if the walls of a fortress are built to keep enemies out or to keep a ruler's fear locked within? Is it possible that the very crown meant to symbolize absolute divinity was, in fact, the heaviest shackle ever forged by human ambition? What if the most violent revolutions in history did not begin with the roar of a battlefield, but with the silent, rhythmic scratching of a quill on cold parchment? Can a single signature truly dismantle centuries of inherited terror, or does power simply change its mask to survive a new era? Do we inhabit a world shaped by the strength of kings, or are we merely living in the debris of their spectacular failures? You might believe that medieval power was a solid, unbreakable granite slab, resting heavily upon the shoulders of the common folk with unquestioned permanence. But the reality of the 13th century was far more fluid, far more fragile, and significantly more dangerous than the polished myths of chivalry suggest. Imagine yourself standing in the center of a drafty stone hall, the air thick with the smell of tallow candles and the damp residue of a relentless English rain that has soaked into the very foundation of the monarchy. The floor beneath your feet is not the smooth marble of a modern palace, but a cold, uneven surface of packed earth and rushes, hiding the decay of yesterday's feast. You are an observer in a room where the atmosphere is so heavy it feels like a physical weight against your chest. A density born from the collective anxiety of men who have realized that their God-given ruler is no longer a shield, but a threat to their own survival. This is not a story of a heroic uprising led by a charismatic visionary. It is a clinical dissection of how a sophisticated system of control begins to fray at the edges until the entire tapestry unravels. We often imagine the King of England as an unreachable sun, radiating authority from a golden throne. But as you move through the corridors of power in 1215, you see something entirely different. You see a man isolated by his own paranoia, a monarch whose word was once law now being filtered through the gritted teeth of his own barons. The expectation was total submission, a hierarchy that mirrored the celestial order of the heavens, yet that expectation is about to be shattered by the mundane reality of failed wars and empty coffers. You are here to witness the precise moment when the invisible threads of loyalty snapped. Not because of a grand philosophical shift, but because the practical mechanics of ruling had become an unbearable burden for those tasked with carrying it. By the time we reach the end of this journey, you will possess a profound understanding of power that transcends the superficial dates and names found in dusty textbooks. You will see how the loss of control is not a sudden event, but a slow, sensory process of erosion that eventually leaves a throne standing in a vacuum. The shift we are exploring today changed the DNA of governance forever, replacing the whims of an individual with the cold, calculated constraints of a written contract. As the wind howls through the arrow slits of the castle, carrying the scent of salt from the distant coast and the metallic tang of unsheathed iron, you begin to realize that the stability you took for granted was always an illusion. The king's shadow, once long and terrifying, now flickers uncertainly against the damp masonry, mirroring the instability of a crown that has lost its grip on the hearts of its subjects. To understand how this happened, we must look past the gold and the silk, focusing instead on the rust, the sweat, and the quiet desperation of a ruling class that decided it would rather defy its king than perish under his incompetence. This was the day the logic of the Middle Ages shifted its axis, creating a tremor that still vibrates through our modern institutions of law and liberty. Before we descend further into the dark corridors of this political collapse, take a moment to look at the foundation of the knowledge you seek. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel, because here, we not only narrate the facts, but we transport your mind to the exact moment in which history was forged, ensuring that you never again see the past as something dead, but as a living, pulsating lesson of how the world we live in was really built. As you step away from the flickering candlelight of the Great Hall, you begin to move through the narrow, winding passageways of the castle, where the air grows colder and the stone walls seem to sweat with the moisture of the English coast. The architecture of power in medieval England was never just about aesthetics. It was a physical manifestation of constraint, designed to funnel bodies and wills into specific patterns of obedience. Notice the texture of the masonry, where the mortar is rough and the chisel marks are still visible, a reminder of the thousands of anonymous hands that labored to build a cage for their own submission. The corridors are narrow, forcing you to walk with a constant awareness of your own vulnerability as every footstep echoes against the vaulted ceilings like a rhythmic heartbeat of an empire in distress. You find yourself descending into the darker, more functional layers of the fortress, passing the armories where the metallic scent of oiled chainmail and the dull thud of whetstones against steel dominate the atmosphere. This is the sensory reality of a monarchy that has shifted from the peak of its expansion to a defensive posture, a king who no longer looks outward at new lands to conquer, but inward at the growing resentment of his own subjects. The temperature drops as you enter the solar, the private chambers where the king's decisions were once whispered in secret, yet even here the silence is not peaceful. It is heavy with the weight of unspoken defiance. You see the heavy oak doors, reinforced with iron bands that look like the ribs of a dying beast, protecting a ruler who can no longer trust the very men who swear him fealty. The light here is filtered through small, high windows, casting long, distorted shadows that dance across the tapestries, turning scenes of noble hunts into distorted images of pursuit and capture. Every creak of the floorboards under your weight feels like a breach of a sanctity that no longer exists, as the spatial organization of the court begins to fracture along lines of fear and necessity. The king moves through these spaces not as a deity, but as a trapped animal, aware that the physical barriers he built to protect his person are now the very walls that isolate him from the reality of his kingdom. You feel the rhythm of the castle shifting, the hurried whispers of messengers, the clatter of horses in the courtyard below, and the low, constant drone of the barons gathering in the shadows of the outer walls. The stability of the realm was built on the assumption that the king was the center of all things, but as you observe the frantic energy of the servants and the cold stars of the guards, you realize the center is no longer holding. The abundance of the royal larder, once a symbol of a flourishing land, now stands in stark contrast to the scarcity of trust that permeates every room. This was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual realization that the geometry of loyalty had become warped, leaving the monarch standing on a foundation of shifting sand while believing he was still atop a mountain of granite. The power shift was not just a political event. It was a sensory transformation, where the familiar sounds of authority became the dissonant noise of a system failing to function under the weight of its own contradictions. As you witness this slow-motion disintegration of the highest office in the land, a profound truth begins to emerge about the nature of those who lead and those who are led. We often find ourselves questioning the strength of our own foundations when the world around us begins to tremble. Imagine the gravity of this moment, where a kingdom's entire future hung by a thread, and ask yourself what you would do if the very ground you stood upon began to give way. "I am the witness of the fallen crown" is the phrase that echoes in the minds of those who see the truth behind the veil of history. If this narrative of crumbling power resonates with your soul, leave a comment saying, "I am the witness of the fallen crown," because admitting that you recognize the fragility of greatness is the first step toward understanding the true nature of the world. The transition from absolute control to shared desperation was now inevitable, and as you move toward the outer gates, you realize that the most dangerous power shift in history was already well underway, written in the very stone and shadow of the castle itself. As you leave the suffocating humidity of the inner chambers and move toward the solar where the king's administrators once dictated the flow of the realm, you begin to feel the sheer weight of the crown, not as a piece of jewelry, but as a failing engine of governance. The functionality of medieval England relied on a delicate, almost invisible clockwork of obligations, where the king provided protection and justice in exchange for the taxes and military service of his barons. But here, in the damp heat of the council room, that clockwork has begun to grind, the gears clogged with the scream of resentment and the rust of repeated failure. You can almost smell the acrid scent of old ink and the dry, dusty aroma of piled sheepskin scrolls, each one a record of a broken promise or a demand too heavy to bear. The king's hand, which once moved with the fluid grace of divine right, now trembles as he reviews the ledgers of debt owed to foreign bankers and the rising tally of lands lost in disastrous continental wars. The transition from a ruler who leads to a ruler who merely reacts is a sensory shift that you can feel in the very vibration of the floorboards. The pressure from the nobility is no longer a distant murmur. It is a physical presence, a collective wall of armored men whose breathing seems to sync with the rhythm of the tide outside the castle walls. Every time the king demands more scutage, the money paid in lieu of military service, the atmosphere in this room thickens, turning the air into something nearly impossible to breathe. You observe the scribes, their fingers stained black with soot-based ink, working frantically to keep up with the shifting allegiances and the desperate legal maneuvers of a monarchy trying to tax its way out of obsolescence. This was the moment when the practical necessity of survival stripped away the thin veneer of royal majesty. The king was no longer the son. He was a debtor in a silk robe, surrounded by creditors who wore swords. The essential nature of the feudal contract was being exposed as a fragile human invention, one that required the constant lubrication of success to keep from seizing up. As you watch the flickering light of a dying hearth reflect off the silver chalices on the table, you realize that the stability of the entire social order was predicated on a confidence that has now evaporated. The risk of total systemic collapse is no longer a theoretical fear. It is the silent guest at every meal, the shadow that follows the king into his bedchamber. It is in this high-stakes environment of political exhaustion that the true value of balance and fair governance becomes clear. If you find yourself captivated by this intricate dance between those who hold the scepter and those who hold the steel, take a moment to acknowledge the depth of the history we are uncovering together. Give this video a like right now to signal that you value these deep dives into the hidden mechanisms of the past, as every click helps preserve these stories of how power is truly won and lost. The shift you are witnessing is the birth of a new kind of reality, where the king's will is no longer the final word, and the cold, hard facts of the ledger begin to dictate the fate of the throne. The atmosphere within the chancellery is no longer one of organized rule, but of a frantic, scratching survival. As you move through this nerve center of the English state, the sensory experience shifts from the metallic clatter of the courtyard to the dry, rhythmic sound of moving parchment. It is a sound like autumn leaves skittering across a stone floor, persistent and unsettling. Here, the true battle for the soul of the monarchy is being fought not with broadswords, but with the sharp nibs of goose quills. You see the clerks, their backs hunched in the dim, gray light filtering through narrow slits, their eyes bloodshot from hours of tracing the convoluted Latin of royal decrees that no longer command the respect they once did. The smell of hot wax, the pungent, earthy scent of the Great Seal, fills the room, a smell that usually signifies the purpose of the king's will. But today, that scent feels different. It is the smell of a desperate bureaucracy trying to anchor a drifting ship. You watch as a heavy scroll is unfurled, the stiff vellum resisting the touch, its surface cold and pale like the skin of a ghost. This parchment represents the invisible cage being built around the monarch. Every line of text, every meticulously drawn initial, is a new boundary, a new definition of what the king can and cannot do. The tension between the king's erratic, impulsive desires and the cold structural requirements of the law is palpable. You can feel the friction in the air, a static charge that builds every time a royal messenger arrives with news of another refused payment or another defiant lord. The king's whim was once a tidal force, capable of reshaping the landscape of the country, but now it is being diverted into 1,000 small channels of red tape and legalistic maneuvering. The abundance of tradition is being strangled by the scarcity of trust. You notice a scribe pause, his pen hovering over the page, the ink dripping like a dark tear, as he realizes that the words he is writing will eventually strip his master of his absolute divinity. This is the sound of the world changing, the rustle of paper, the snap of a wax seal, and the heavy breathing of men who realize that the pen is indeed becoming mightier than the scepter. The shift is functional, almost mechanical, as the machinery of the state begins to demand its own autonomy from the man who wears the crown. It is a terrifying and fascinating transformation to behold, as the abstract concept of the crown begins to separate from the fallible human being who physically possesses it. This transition is so pivotal, so fundamental to the world we inhabit today, that it deserves to be understood by everyone who values the balance of power. If you feel the weight of this historical turning point, take a second to share this video with someone who appreciates the deep, hidden currents that shape our civilization. By spreading this knowledge, you help ensure that the lessons of the past are never silenced by the noise of the present. As the sun begins to set, casting long, bloody streaks of light across the ink-stained tables, you realize that the king's signature is no longer a mark of power, but a confession of his own limitations. Moving beyond the cramped desks of the scribes, you ascend toward the high battlements where the wind whistles through the crenellations, a cold and indifferent witness to the fragile geometry of loyalty. From this height, the kingdom looks like a vast, green chessboard, yet the pieces are not made of wood or ivory, but of bloodlines and ancient oaths that are beginning to splinter. You can feel the vibration of the wind against the stone, a low hum that resonates with the instability of the social hierarchy below. The contrast here is stark. The physical permanence of the castle walls suggests a world that should last forever, yet the human bonds that hold it together are as thin as the mist rolling off the English Channel. You observe the banners fluttering in the gale, their silk fabric snapping with the sound of distant whip cracks, representing families that have stood by the throne for generations. But as you look closer at the men patrolling these heights, you see the hesitation in their eyes, the way they grip their polearms a little too tightly when the king's name is mentioned. The abundance of historical tradition, the stories of William the Conqueror, and the heavy hand of the Angevin is now being weighed against the immediate risk of a king who demands everything and provides nothing. The stability of a lineage is a heavy thing, a burden of expectation that stretches back through time, but you are witnessing the moment it becomes a liability. The risk of rebellion is no longer a shadow in the distance, it is a cold sweat on the brow of the nobility. You see the intricate web of marriages, land grants, and debts that once created a unified front, now being pulled apart by the centrifugal force of the king's incompetence. Each stone in this fortress was laid with the assumption that the man at the top was the ultimate arbiter of justice. But as the sun dips below the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the bailey, that assumption feels like an antique curiosity. The functional reality of the Middle Ages was that a king was only as strong as the consensus of his greatest subjects, and that consensus has turned into a sharpened blade. The sensory experience of this decline is found in the silence between orders, the way the light dies on the horizon, without the usual comfort of a secure tomorrow. You are standing at the edge of a precipice, where the old world of absolute command meets the new world of negotiated survival. The geometry of the state is being redrawn, and the lines are being etched in the weary faces of those who realize that loyalty to a crown is a hollow virtue if the head wearing it has lost its way. The shift is not just in the laws, but in the very soul of the people, as they begin to realize that their safety lies not in the whim of a monarch, but in the strength of their own collective resistance. You move now from the vertical isolation of the battlements to the horizontal vulnerability of the open field, where the air is no longer trapped by stone but carries the sharp, cold breath of the Thames. This is Runnymede, a saturated meadow where the ground gives way under your boots with a heavy, wet squelch, a sensory reminder that the foundations of the monarchy have shifted from solid granite to treacherous mud. The atmosphere here is a dense fog of stagnant water and the metallic scent of thousands of armored men standing in silent, disciplined rows. Imagine the sound of the river, a low, indifferent gurgle that ignores the monumental friction of the human history unfolding on its banks. The temperature has dropped, and a fine, persistent mist clings to the surcoats of the barons, turning the bright heraldry of England into muted, damp stains. You are no longer in a place of architectural comfort. You are in a space of raw, elemental confrontation where the sky feels low and the horizon is crowded with the vertical lines of spears. The king is no longer protected by the thick masonry of Windsor. He is exposed in a silk pavilion that shivers in the wind, its fabric snapping like a frantic pulse. The contrast between the fragile, colorful luxury of the royal tent and the cold, gray steel of the surrounding army creates a visual tension that is almost unbearable. Every clink of a bridle, every muffled cough from the ranks of the dissatisfied vibrates through the damp soil and into the soles of your feet. This is the spatial reality of a power shift. The king, once the apex of a mountain, is now surrounded in a valley. The functional purpose of this meeting is not a celebration, but a surgical intervention to save a dying body politic. You feel the weight of the moment in the way the air seems to resist movement, a stillness that precedes a lightning strike. The barons do not move with the fluidity of courtiers. They stand with the heavy-rooted permanence of men who have decided that the risk of death is preferable to the stability of a tyrant's whim. The abundance of the meadow's green is a mockery of the scarcity of peace, as the very grass beneath the king's feet seems to witness his descent from absolute ruler to a man bound by the demands of his inferiors. This is the geography of defiance, a place where the map of England was not redrawn with ink, but defined by the physical presence of those who refused to move. The cold breath of the river marks the end of an era of unchallenged shadows, forcing the crown into the harshness, unforgiving light of a new, shared responsibility. Within the shivering walls of the royal pavilion at Runnymede, the light is dim, filtered through heavy, damp silk that struggles to keep out the gray afternoon. You are now a witness to the ink that bound a king, a sensory experience that defines the moment the monarchy's pulse slowed under the weight of a legal tourniquet. The air inside the tent is thick with the scent of wet wool, stale breath, and the sharp, vinegar-like odor of the oak gall ink waiting in a small silver well. Watch as the king's hand hovers over the vellum, a surface made from the skin of a calf, scraped thin and white until it is as smooth as bone. The texture of the parchment is cold and unforgiving, resisting the warmth of the king's touch. This is the precise technical moment of the loss of autonomy. Each clause of the document is a link in a chain being forged in real time. The sound of the quill scratching against the vellum is not a flourish, but a rhythmic, grating noise, like a key turning in a lock that hasn't been opened in centuries. You can feel the friction between the tip of the feather and the surface of the state's new reality. This act of writing is a physical dismantling of the divine right. For the first time, the king is not the source of the law, but a subject to it. The abundance of royal prerogative is being systematically harvested and redistributed among the men in iron who stand just outside the tent's flap. The functionality of this document, the Magna Carta, lies in its cold, clinical precision. It defines the width of a bridge, the weight of a measure of grain, and the specific rights of a widow, stripping the king of the power to be arbitrary. It is a transition from the fluid, unpredictable whim of a man to the rigid, predictable stability of a contract. You observe the heavy red wax being melted over a small flame, its heat a sharp contrast to the damp chill of the meadow. When the great seal is pressed into that cooling wax, the sound is a soft, wet thud, yet it echoes like a cannon blast across the plains of history. The king is no longer a predator, he is a signatory. His signature is a confession that the crown can no longer survive on fear alone. This is the moment when the abstract concept of sovereignty was pinned down like an insect in a display case, studied and restricted by those who once trembled at its shadow. The shift is complete, not in the heart of the king, but in the physical reality of the parchment that now lies between him and his people, a barrier of ink that no sword can easily cut. As the ink dries on the meadow of Runnymede, the ripple of this power shift begins to travel far beyond the silk tents of the elite, moving like a slow, cold wave toward the thatched roofs and muddy furrows of the English countryside. You are now observing the aftershock in the fields, where the sensory reality of the common man remains one of grueling labor, yet the very air he breathes has begun to change its composition. The smell of damp earth and the rhythmic thud of the wooden plow are the same, but the structural weight pressing down on the peasantry has shifted its center of gravity. For centuries, the stability of the village was anchored to a singular, distant point of absolute authority: the king's shadow. Now that shadow has been fractured. You see the village bailiff, a man whose authority was once an extension of the royal whim, now hesitating as he calculates the new limits of his power. The abundance of the harvest is no longer just a tribute to a crown. It is becoming part of a negotiated economy where even the smallest deviation in tax or service is questioned under the light of this new written order. The contrast between the high-level political drama of the barons and the gritty, tactile survival of the serf is profound. In the local markets, the sound of haggling over the price of wool or the weight of a loaf of bread carries a new, sharper edge, reflecting the document's insistence on fair measures and the rule of law. You can feel the fragility of this transition in the way the local lord looks at his tenant, not just as a possession, but as a component of a system that now has rules he cannot simply ignore. The functionality of daily life is being recalibrated. The risk of being seized without cause, although still a shadow in the mind of the poor, has begun to recede as the concept of due process starts its long, agonizingly slow journey from the parchment to the dirt. This is not a sudden liberation, but a fundamental change in the atmosphere of the realm. The heavy, suffocating blanket of total monarchy has been replaced by a thinner, more breathable layer of shared obligation. The shift is felt in the silence of the woods, where the king's deer are no longer just symbols of a hunter god, but assets of a state that is learning to define its own boundaries. As you witness this slow-motion awakening of a nation's conscience, you realize that the events at Runnymede were merely the first domino in a line that stretches toward the modern world. This transformation of the common life, the movement from being a subject to becoming a stakeholder in the law, is a story that belongs to all of us. If you feel the importance of this bridge between the medieval past and our present reality, take a moment to share this video with those who seek to understand the true origin of their own rights. By sharing, you ensure that the echo of that scratching quill in the meadow reaches every corner of our collective memory, just as it once reached every corner of the English fields. As the physical artifacts of the Great Charter are locked away in iron-bound chests, you find yourself ascending into a realm of pure, cold thought, where the ghost of divine right still wanders the corridors of power like a pale, flickering flame. The sensory world of mud, ink, and armor begins to thin, replaced by the dense, suffocating atmosphere of a fading ideology. You are now observing the elevation of a struggle from the material to the philosophical, where the crown is no longer seen as a halo of light, but as a heavy, hollow circle of gold. The smell of incense in the royal chapel, once the aromatic proof of a king's direct connection to the heavens, now carries a hint of something sour like a dying fire. You can feel the vibration of a silent, intellectual earthquake that has leveled the mountain of absolute rule. The contrast here is between the old world of unquestioned obedience and the new, terrifying landscape of accountability. The king moves through his palace like a man haunted by a shadow he can no longer control, his every gesture shadowed by the invisible presence of a law that stands taller than he does. This is the moment where the divine right becomes a ghost, a memory of a power that once claimed to be the soul of the universe, now reduced to a functional office. The abundance of religious symbolism, intended to justify the king's every whim, now struggles against the scarcity of its own credibility. You realize that the stability of the entire medieval world was built on a lie that everyone agreed to believe, and now that the lie has been exposed by a piece of parchment, the very air feels thinner, more fragile. The risk of this shift is not just political, it is existential. If the king is not God's chosen, then who are we? This question hangs in the stillness of the throne room, echoing off the cold stone statues of ancestors who ruled with iron fists. The transition is profound, moving from a reality where power was a gift from above to one where it is a negotiation from below. You see the king's crown resting on a velvet cushion, its jewels catching the dying light of a winter sun, and you realize it is no longer a sacred relic, but a piece of legal property. The shift has elevated the human condition, replacing the blind terror of a subject with the watchful eye of a citizen. This is the philosophical core of the power shift, the realization that no man is so high that he is above the reach of a common truth. The eternal echo of the shift now resonates through the centuries, a vibration that started in the damp soil of a riverbank and eventually shattered the very foundations of absolute power across the globe. As you stand in the present, looking back through the heavy, distorted glass of history, the sensory details of that day, the smell of the rain, the scratch of the quill, and the cold metallic weight of the baron's defiance, feel less like a memory and more like a living blueprint of our own reality. The architecture of our modern world was built on the debris of that broken monarchy, replacing the singular erratic pulse of a king with the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of the law. You can almost feel the texture of the freedom you possess today, a fabric woven from the very vellum that King John was forced to touch with his trembling seal. The contrast between the total arcaneness of a tyrant's whim and the imperfect yet persistent light of constitutional right is the most profound legacy of this medieval collapse. The functional stability of our societies depends on the memory of that day when the crown lost control, proving that power is not a divine gift, but a temporary trust held by the hands of the many. The abundance of our current liberties is the direct descendant of that moment of extreme scarcity and risk. As the shadows of the past finally merge with the light of the present, the significance of this transition reaches its peak. We are no longer subjects of a crown, but masters of a contract. This journey through the veins of a dying empire has shown us that true strength lies not in the height of a throne, but in the depth of a shared truth that no one is above the law. If you have journeyed with me through these corridors of time and felt the weight of the history that shaped your world, now is the moment to anchor that knowledge. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel, because here we not only narrate the facts, but we transport your mind to the exact moment in which history was forged, ensuring that you never again see the past as something dead, but as a living, pulsating lesson of how the world we live in was really built. If you've watched this far, it's because you liked this case. Leave a comment saying, "I've watched this far," so I can get to know you and know who really likes the stories here on the channel. Don't forget to strengthen this recovery of human memory and share this documentary with those who believe that freedom was a gift and not an achievement carved in iron and suffering. The echo of Runnymede still sounds, and now you are part of its history.